Judith Merrow buried her husband in the Crimea and came home to a village that spat on her garden gate. The children pulled her physic herbs up by the root and threw them in the lane, feverfew and chamomile trampled in the dust. She did not weep. She knelt in the dirt in her black dress, and she put them back, one by one, and pressed the soil down with her thumbs. At the July vestry, the apothecary Silas Coldwell stood before 40 gathered parishioners, and he pointed at her through the crowd, and he said, "Weeds and widow's grief. That patch grows nothing a Christian needs." And the young doctor, Ambrose Finch, laughed along with the rest of them. Judith Merrow said nothing. She was walked to the door. What none of them knew was what she kept locked in a box beneath her bed, and what the low green well by the tannery was already breeding in the summer heat. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we begin, if a story like this is why you're here, take 1 second and subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels, from one screen to the next, across the whole quiet dark. Now, let me take you back. The parish was called Nettlefield. 340 souls set low in the Cambridgeshire fen, where the land lies flat as a spilled dish and the sky goes on forever. In summer, the water sat still in the dikes, the reeds hummed with flies, and the heat came down and did not lift, day after day, so that even the old men who had never left the fen said they could not remember a July so close. Judith Merrow had come back 3 winters before. A widow, she took the last cottage on the Sedge Row, the one with the sunk roof and the crooked chimney, the one nobody wanted because it stood too near the wet ground. She paid her rent on the day it was due. She kept to herself, and behind the cottage, in the poor black soil, she made a garden. It was not a pretty garden. It grew no roses. It grew feverfew, pale and small flowered. It grew chamomile that she dried in flat trays on the windowsill, blackberry root, which she dug in the autumn and split and hung from the beams, willow bark, peppermint, a low bed of comfrey by the wall. It was a working garden. Everything in it had a use, and she knew every use, though she never once said aloud how she knew. The village had a name for it. They called it the widow's weed patch. They said it behind their hands in the market, and sometimes not behind their hands at all. But here is the thing they did not see, or chose not to see. On the doorsteps of the poor of a winter morning, clean linen would appear, folded, left without a knock, a shirt for a man out of work, a shawl for an old woman with the cough. Nobody ever caught her at it. Nobody thanked her, because there was no one to thank. It simply came, the way frost comes, quiet in the night, and by the time you were up it was already done. She had learned that once, a long way from the fen. She had learnt it in a place where clean linen was the difference between a man who lived and a man who did not. But that is later in the story. Hold it for me. On the high street, at the sign of the Mortar and Pestle, Silas Coldwell's shop did a fine trade. He was a big soft man of 48, pink in the face, with a waistcoat that strained at its buttons and a voice made for a pulpit he had never been given. He sold powders and purges and pastilles. He sold a bottle he called his own preparation, his cordial drops, at 2 shillings and 6 the bottle, and there was hardly a mantel in Nettlefield without one standing on it. He was churchwarden. He counted the collection. When he spoke, the parish leaned in to hear, and beside him, newer to the village but rising fast, stood Dr. Ambrose Finch. He was 29. London trained, he had letters after his name and a black bag with brass clasps, and he believed in what was written in his books the way other men believe in Scripture. He bled his patients. He dosed them with calomel, the mercury salt, till their gums ran and their teeth loosened, because that was the treatment, and the treatment was correct. He was certain. He had never in his life been anything but certain, and the parish took his certainty for wisdom as people will. Between these two men and the widow at the end of Sedge Row, there was no quarrel at first. There was only distance. They were the future, brass clasps and printed labels. She was the past, dirt under her nails and a dead husband's name. And the village, wanting to be modern, wanting to be respectable, chose its side without ever quite deciding to. The one who led them was Mrs. Honoria Pruitt, the vicar's wife. 44, straight-backed, with a mouth set like a Sunday latch. She ran the parish the way her husband could not, from the second pew and the parish room and the doorway of every cottage where a christening or a burying gave her cause to call. And Mrs. Pruitt had decided early and firmly that the widow Merrow was not quite the thing. Foreign, somehow, though she was Cambridgeshire-born, marked by whatever she had seen out there in the war. When Judith came into church, the pews near her emptied by inches, women drawing their skirts, and Mrs. Pruitt at the head of them with her chin up, and it was done so smoothly that you could not have called it cruelty. It was only manners. That is the worst kind. So that was Nettlefield, in the summer of 1866. The heat and the flies and the still water, the proud shop and the certain young doctor and the cold, straight vicar's wife. And at the end of the row, a woman in black, on her knees in a weed patch, asking nothing of anyone. Now let me show you the box. It stood beneath her bed, wrapped in oilcloth, and it was a soldier's field kit, her husband's. Thomas Merrow, sergeant, dead of the fever before Sevastopol, in a war she had followed him into, and come home from alone. The kit was wood, brass-cornered, with a lock she kept oiled, though she never opened it where anyone could see. Some nights the neighbours might have heard, if they had listened, the small sound of her working the hinge with a drop of oil on a rag. She kept it as you keep a thing that is half a tool and half a grave. She never spoke of it, not once, in 3 winters, to a living soul. There was one moment, only one, and it passed so fast that afterward the boy himself half doubted it. A child on the row, the tenny boy, upset a kettle and scolded his forearm to a red wheel and screamed the street awake. Before his mother had her shawl on, Judith was there. She had the arm under cool water from the butt, and then she had it dressed, wrapped clean and quick and sure, her hands moving in a way that made the watching women fall silent, because those hands did not fumble. They knew. And as she tied the last of it off, she said, low, almost to herself, "I've seen worse than a fen burn." And nobody asked her what she meant. The moment closed over. The boy stopped crying. The women went back to their doorsteps. But if you had been there, if you had watched those hands, you would have known that this was not a gardener. Not only a gardener. Hold that too. The heat did not break. It built. By the middle of July, the dikes had dropped and gone green at the edges, and the smell came up off the wet ground, sweetish and thick, and hung in the lanes. Worst of all was the low green well, down by the tannery, where the ground fell away toward the old midden, the great sour heap of the tanner's leavings, hides and lime and rot, that had been growing there for a generation not 30 feet from where the folk of the low end drew their water. In the cool of other years nobody minded it much, but now the flies came off that midden in clouds, a shifting black skin over the whole of it, and they went where they liked. On to the meat in the larders, on to the lip of the well bucket, on to the mouths of sleeping children. Judith Merrow saw it. She walked down that way of an evening with her basket, past the low green, and she saw the flies thick on the well stones, and she saw the midden festering below it, and she smelled what the summer was making down there, and something in her went cold in all that heat. She stopped at the Sowerby cottage, nearest the well, where a woman she barely knew was drawing water for the family's supper. And Judith set down her basket, and she spoke, plainly, the way she did not often speak. "Don't give them that water as it comes," she said. "Not this month. Boil it first, hard, and let it cool. Boil every drop that goes into their mouths till the weather breaks. The Sowerby woman looked at her, looked at the water, clear enough in the bucket, looked back. "Boil it," Judith said again. "The heat's got into it. There's something in it now that wasn't in it in the spring. I know the look of it." "Please," and the woman laughed. Not unkindly even, just the easy laugh of a body who has drawn from that well her whole life and her mother before her. "Boil good well water in July?" she said. "In this? You'd have us all faint at the range. It's the sweetest water in the parish, everyone says so. You keep to your herbs, missus, we'll keep to our well." Judith looked at her a moment longer. Then she picked up her basket. She had said it once. That was her way. She would warn a soul once, plainly, and then she would withdraw, because pride kept her from begging to be believed. It was her flaw, and she knew it, and she could not master it. She warned once. And she went home. That was the first time she named it. Remember the date, if you can hold dates. The thing she saw coming was already 12 days out, and counting down, and only she had read the clock. Word travels in a small place. By the next Sunday it was all over Nettlefield that the widow Merrow had told the Sowerbys their well was poisoned, told them to boil it. In July, and the parish, which loved a thing to laugh at the way a dry field loves a match, laughed. Coldwell laughed loudest, because it touched his trade. A man who tells folk their water is bad is a man edging toward the physician's ground, and Coldwell did not care to share. In his shop, weighing out powders, he made a comedy of it. "The widow's turned wise woman," he said to whoever came in. "Boil your water, burn your fires, and when you've done all her fretting for her, come to me for what actually mends a body." And the customers chuckled and bought their cordial drops and went home, and did not boil anything. And so we come to the vestry. This is the loudest scene, so let me set it slow. There was a meeting called for the last week of July in the vestry room behind the church to settle the parish accounts and the matter of the roads. 40 souls came, near enough, packed onto the benches in the heat, the men fanning themselves with their hats, Mrs. Pruitt in the front with the ledger, Coldwell beside her as churchwarden, Dr. Finch at the end of the bench with his legs crossed and his certainty on his face, and at the back, come in late and quiet, in her black dress, the widow Merrow. She had not meant to speak. She had told herself, walking down, that she had warned the one house, and that was her duty done. But she sat at the back, and she listened to them talk of gravel for the Ely Road, of the price of a new hymn-board, of everything under the sun but the thing that mattered. And something rose in her that she could not put down. Because she had smelled the low green that evening on her way, and it was worse. And she knew the way you know a storm is coming from the ache in an old brake, that they were sitting there arguing about gravel with death already in the water, not 400 yards off. So she stood. The benches creaked as folk turned. It was so unlike her that the room went quiet all at once. "I'll say a thing," she said, "and then I'll sit, and you may do as you please with it. The low green well is fouled. The midden's rotted into the ground this dry summer, and the flies carry it, and the heat's ripened it, and if this parish does not move that midden and boil every drop it drinks from the low end, there will be fever in Nettlefield before the corn's cut. I have seen this before. I know what it looks like when it starts. It has started. Move the midden, boil the water. I ask nothing else, and I'll take up no more of your evening." For a moment, nobody spoke. And then Dr. Finch uncrossed his legs and smiled the smile of a man who has read the books. "Madam," he said, pleasantly, to the room as much as to her, "we are grateful for your concern, but the science of contagion is a subject of some delicacy, and it is not learned over a garden fence. Fever comes from the air, from the noxious vapours of low ground, every authority is agreed, not from good clear well water. This is precisely the sort of old wife superstition it is my business to correct. Boil the water indeed, you'll have us afraid of our own suppers." And he spread his hands, and there was a ripple of laughing. Judith did not sit. "Call it a wife's superstition if you like," she said, and her voice did not rise, but it carried. "I've watched more men die of it than you've yet had patience, Doctor. It comes by the water. I'd stake my life on it. I'd stake yours, which I fear I already have." That last landed harder than she meant. There was a stir, and into that stir stepped Silas Coldwell, and he had been waiting, you understand, he had been waiting all evening for the room to be with him, and now it was, and he rose in his tight waistcoat, and he turned to face her down the length of the vestry, and he gave the parish the line that it would repeat for 100 years. "Weeds and widow's grief," he said. "That patch grows nothing a Christian needs, and this parish will not be frightened into folly by a poor soul who's had too much sorrow and too much sun." He shook his head, slow and sad and kind as a hangman. "Go home, Mrs. Merrow, tend your garden. Leave the health of Nettlefield to the men whose trade it is." The laughing came then, in earnest, low and rolling around the benches, and Mrs. Pruitt's cold small smile from the front, and Finch shaking his head over his folded arms. And two of the sidesmen, decent men who thought they were being gentle, came and stood one at each of Judith's elbows, not touching her, only there, only making it plain, and walked her the length of the vestry to the door. She went with her back straight. She did not argue. She had said her once. At the door she stopped and looked back over the whole laughing room, and there was no anger in her face, which was somehow worse, and she said, quietly, "I hope to God I'm wrong." And she went out into the hot dark. She was not wrong. You know she was not wrong. But mark how it stood that night. One woman walked to a door, laughed out of a room, against a shop and a doctor and a vicar's wife and 40 of her neighbours. Everything she owned in the world was her word, and they had just thrown her word in the lane like her feverfew. That is where we are. Hold it, because now the wheel begins to turn, and it turns slow, and it does not turn back. 9 days after the vestry, the first child took sick. It was a tannery child, of course. Of course it was. A little girl of the Marsh family, 6 years old, whose people drew their water from the low green well, and had laughed with the rest at the widow's fretting. She was well at noon, and griping by dark, and by the small hours she was worse than any gripe her mother had seen, doubled and voiding, the flux running out of her like water from a split cask, so that no matter what went in, more ran out. And then, toward dawn, the thing that stopped her mother's heart. The child's skin began to change, the lips first, then the fingertips, then the hollows of the eyes, a grey blue creeping in, the colour of a slate roof in the rain, the colour of no living child. The blue that the fen would come to know so well in the weeks ahead that mothers would check their children's fingernails 100 times a day. The blue that meant the cholera. They sent for Finch, naturally, not for the widow, for the doctor, with his brass clasps and his books. He came. He was not a cruel man. Understand, that is the pity of it. He was a certain man, which in a plague is nearly the same thing. He looked at the child, and he named it a summer flux and a congestion of the blood, and he did the correct thing, the thing the books all agreed on. He bled her. He opened a vein in that small arm and drew off the blood she could not spare, because the book said the fever was in the blood and the blood must come out. And he dosed her with calomel, grain after grain of the mercury salt, to purge her, though she was purging herself to death already. And Coldwell, hearing of a case, sent up his cordial drops by the boy, 2 and 6 the bottle, and then, seeing which way it went, 3 cases of them by the cart, for the whole low end, because a frightened parish buys. And the child got worse. Every drop of the treatment made her worse, and every worsening only proved to Finch that she had needed more of it. Sooner, this is the trap the certain man is caught in, and there is no way out of it from the inside. She sank through the second day. The bleeding took the last of her strength. By the second night she lay grey on the bed, with her eyes gone back in her head, and her breath like a saw, and her mother out of her wits, and the neighbours in the doorway not daring to come in. At the end of Sedge Row, Judith Merrow heard of it. She always heard. She knew the exact hour the first case had shown, because she had been waiting for it the way you wait for a thing you have read in the sky. And when she heard the doctor was bleeding the Marsh child, she stood a long moment in her dark kitchen with her hand pressed flat on the table, and those who could have seen her would have seen a grief go across her face that was older than Nettlefield. A grief that knew exactly what a bled cholera patient looks like at the end, because she had held that end in her 2 hands more times than she could count, on a hillside above a black sea, a long way and a long time ago. She did not go. Not that night. Do you understand why? Because she had warned them once and been walked to a door, and her pride, the one flaw she could never dig out of herself, root and all, her pride would not let her walk uninvited into a house that had laughed at her, to be turned from the step. She stood at her own table, and she fought it. And the fight, God forgive her, took 2 days. But something in her had already decided, even while she stood still. Because in those 2 days, alone, at night, she began to make ready. Let me show you this, because nobody else saw it, and it is the heart of who she was. By rushlight, in the small hours when the row was asleep and the flies had settled, Judith Merrow prepared for a war she alone knew was coming. She went out into the black garden, and she dug blackberry root by feel, the thick old crowns of it. And she brought them in, and she washed them and split them and set them to dry and to boil, because the boiled root, the tannin in it, would bind a gut that cholera was trying to pour out onto the floor. She did not have a name for what she fought. No one had the true name of it yet, the little living thing in the water that would not be seen down a lens for years to come. But she had the thing itself, which is better than the name. She had watched it. She knew that the killing was not the flux itself, but the drought inside it, the body wrung dry faster than it could be filled, and that the whole of the cure, the whole of it, was clean water going in as fast as the foul water ran out. Clean water, boiled and cooled and salted a little and sweetened a little, spooned in hour upon patient hour, faster than death could empty the cask. That was the secret the London books did not hold, and she held it in her 2 hands. So she boiled. She had barrels going, and she scrubbed them, and she filled them from her own high well and boiled the water hard and set it to cool under clean cloths. She tore old sheeting into squares, and she boiled that too and dried it stiff and clean. Because she knew about clean, she had learned about clean in the one place on earth where a woman learned it hardest. She ground her peppermint for the sickness and her chamomile for the cramping. She lined her stores along the shelf in the dark, the crocks of cooled water, the dried root, the folded clean cloth, the little twists of salt and sugar, and she counted them, and she knew it was not enough for a parish, not near enough. But it was what 1 pair of hands could make in 2 nights, and she made it. And while she made it, not one soul in Nettlefield knew that at the far end of Sedge Row a magazine was being filled against the day the guns began, and the whole time, under the bed, wrapped in its oilcloth, the box waited. On the 2nd night, near midnight, she stopped. She stood in the middle of her boiling, breathing kitchen, with a crock of cooled, clean water in her arms, and she looked at it, and she thought of the Marsh child 3 fields off, grey and going, being bled by a certain young man while her mother knelt. And her pride broke. It did not break gently. It broke like a bank going in a flood, all at once, and the water of who she truly was came through. She did not knock at any door to ask leave. She took a yoke and she hung 2 crocks of the boiled water from it, and she filled a basket with the dried root and the clean cloth and a spoon, and she banked her fire, and she wrapped her dark shawl over her head, and she went out into the summer night and crossed the sleeping parish alone. The fen was silent. The dykes gleamed under a low moon. She walked the mile to the tannery end with the yoke cutting her shoulders and did not slow. She came to the Marsh cottage where a single light burned, and the door stood on the latch, because the family had given up guarding anything, and she pushed it open and went in without a word. The father was slumped at the table, past weeping. The mother knelt at the bed where the child lay so still and so blue that Judith's heart went down like a stone. But the small chest still moved. Barely, it still moved. The mother looked up at the figure in the doorway, the widow they had laughed at, come in the dead of night, with a yoke across her shoulders and her sleeves already going back up her arms, and she had no strength left even to be ashamed. "I've come to sit with her," Judith said. "Only that. Go and lie down an hour. I'll not leave her." And she set down her crocks, and she rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and she went to work. And here, if you had been in that room, you would have seen at last, plain in the rushlight, what those hands were. She stripped the fouled bed with the child still on it, quick and sure, sliding clean-boiled sheeting under her, the way a body learns to do only by doing it 1,000 times over. She put her palm to the child's cold cheek and read her like a page. She lifted the small grey head into the crook of her arm, and with a spoon she began the long patient work that no book in Finch's bag knew. Clean water, salted, sweetened, a spoon at a time between the cracked lips. A spoon. Wait. A spoon. When the child voided, she cleaned her and changed the cloth, and began again. She dosed the boiled root to bind, and she gave the water to fill, over and over, hour upon hour, through the whole long turning of that night, matching every drop the sickness stole with a drop of clean going back in. It was not magic. It was not even, to look at, anything much. It was only a woman, and a spoon, and a crock of boiled water, and a refusal, an absolute refusal, to let the drought win. But it was the only thing in all of Cambridgeshire that could have saved that child, and she had it, and she gave it. And she asked no one for a farthing, and told no one she had gone. Toward dawn the child's breath changed. The sore went out of it. A little warmth came back into the small hands where the blue had been, the faintest flush of a living pink at the fingertips, and near sunrise, when Judith spooned a thin warm broth to her lips, the child swallowed it, and held it, and did not bring it back. Held it. Do you understand what that was? Held it, the first food to stay down. The turning. The child was going to live. Judith Merrow knelt by that bed as the grey light came up in the window, and she did not smile, and she did not wake the sleeping parents to tell them, and she did not, God knows, go out to shout it down the lane to the men who had walked her to a door. She simply set the crock where the mother would find it, and she wrote nothing, and she gathered her empty yoke, and before the family was fully awake, she let herself out into the pale morning and walked the mile home with the light coming up gold over the flat wet fen, one woman, alone, carrying an empty yoke, having done in the dark and unpaid the one thing the whole clever village could not do. In the light. She did not know it yet, she could not have known it, walking home so tired, but the sickness that had taken one child that week was not one child's sickness. It was in the well. And the well fed a whole row, and the row fed the market, and the market fed the parish. What she had read at the vestry was true, and it was moving now, under the floors and along the lanes. In every unboiled bucket in the low end, patient and blind and coming. And back down the sedge row, as she latched her own door and leaned her head against it and closed her eyes, the church clock struck 5 over Nettlefield. Somewhere on the far side of the parish, in a second cottage and then a third, a mother put her hand to a child's hot forehead in the new daylight, and frowned, and did not yet know to be afraid. The fever had only just begun to send them. The second cottage was the Sowerby woman's. You remember her. She stood at the low green well with her bucket, and heard Judith Merrow say, plain as bread, that the water was fouled and would bring the flux, and she laughed behind her hand and told her neighbours the widow had gone soft in the head. She drew her water the same as always. She boiled nothing, and on the 4th day of that hot week her eldest went down at noon with the cramping and the thirst, and by dark the child's eyes had sunk back in its skull, and its skin had gone the grey-blue of a drowned thing. She did not send for Judith. Pride runs both ways in a small place. She sent for Dr. Finch. Finch came. 29 years old, London-schooled, his bag of shining tools, and he did what his books had taught him. He said the cause was the bad air off the midden, the miasma, the vapour. He opened a vein in the child's thin arm and let the blood run into a basin to draw the fever out. He spooned calomel between the cracked lips, the mercury salt, to purge the corruption. And the child, already dry as a husk from the flux, already emptied of every drop of water in its little body, was bled and purged until there was nothing left in it to lose. It died before the church clock struck 5 the next morning. Finch wrote in his ledger that the case had been beyond help. He believed it. That is the terrible part. He was not a cruel man. He was a certain one. And certainty in a doctor is a knife that cuts the wrong way. And 2 doors down, in the tannery end, another well-mouth breathed its poison up into another bucket. By the end of that week the low green row was a row of sick rooms. You could stand at the top of Sedge Lane and count the houses by the sound coming out of them. The cramping cry of children. The low moan of grown men laid flat who had never been laid flat by anything. The smell of it, and over it all, from the high street, the little brass bell of Silas Coldwell's shop, ringing and ringing as the door swung. For business, you understand, was never better. Coldwell was 48, and he knew a rising market when he saw one. His shelves held a patent remedy, a small brown bottle with a fine printed label, Coldwell's Cordial Drops. A certain preventative and cure for cholera morbus and all fluxes of the bowel. 2 shillings and 6pence the bottle, and now the whole parish was afraid, and fear buys anything. The bottles went out by the dozen, by the crate. Mothers who could not spare the bread money spared it for the drops and dosed their children with a bright false hope and set the empty bottle proud upon the mantel. The drops did nothing. They could do nothing. But a frightened parish does not want nothing. It wants a bottle it can hold. And when the crates began to run low, Silas Coldwell did the thing that tells you exactly what manner of man he was. He did not lower the price to help the poor in their terror. He raised it. The same little bottle that had been 2 and 6 on the Monday was 4 shillings by the Friday. And he sold every one, and he wrote the takings in a black book with a small dry satisfaction. And he told Mrs. Pruitt across the counter that Providence tried the faithful, and the wise man kept his nerve. He kept his nerve for 9 days. On the 10th, when the churchyard had 4 fresh graves in it, and the sexton was digging by lamplight, when the sickness had climbed off the low green row and up toward the middling houses, when a man could no longer pretend it was only the poor and the careless who were dying, on the 10th day Silas Coldwell shut his shop at noon, drew the blind, and did not open it again. His neighbours thought he had taken ill himself. He had not. He had counted. He had looked at the graves and looked at his black book and understood, in the cold clerk's heart of him, that the flux was not stopping, and that a man who had sold a false cure to a parish that was now burying its children would be a poor man to become the reckoning. So he packed his strong-box, the takings of the whole bad summer, 4 shillings a bottle. And in the grey before dawn Silas Coldwell put his box on the seat of a hired trap and drove out the county road toward the town, away from Nettlefield, away from the dying he had drawn his profit from, and he did not look back at the church he had wardened, nor at the well he had told them was clean. He thought he was driving toward safety. Hold that. We will come back for him. Now, while the drops were failing and the doctor was bleeding and the apothecary was running, something else was moving through Nettlefield. Quieter, under the fear, the way water moves under ice. It was a piece of talk, just a few words, passed hand to hand at the pump over the low wall at the churchyard gate. The widow's ones don't die. for it was noticed. In a village of 340 souls, everything is noticed in the end. The marsh child, the tannery girl, 6 years old, the very first to go down, she had lived. Everyone had seen Finch shake his head over her. Everyone had thought her lost. And she was up now, thin and pale but up, playing in her doorway. And her mother, when the neighbour women asked, had gone quiet and then said what she had puzzled over for a fortnight, that she had woken one grey morning to find a stranger gone from the house and a crock of water on the shelf with salt and sugar spooned in it and a folded cloth and her child's fever broken. She had not seen the face, but she had a guess. There was only one soul in the parish who had said, out loud, before any of it, that the low green water would do this. And then the Tenny house, where Judith had once dressed a scolded boy's hands in a breath. They had sickened, all 3 children, and Judith had come to them in the night, unasked, with her yoke and her crocks, and made them boil every drop and spooned her salted water into the young ones hour upon hour, and the Tenny children lived, and the Hobie house, down the far end, the same. Wherever the widow had gone in the dark with her clean-boiled water, the children got up again. And wherever Finch had gone with his lancet and his little box of mercury, the bells rang for a funeral. It should have turned the whole parish to her door in a day. It did not yet. Because to go to Judith Merrow now was to say aloud that they had been wrong at the vestry, wrong to laugh, wrong to walk her to the door, and a proud people will die before they will say that. Some of them did. But the talk moved. The widows' ones don't die. And in a house where a child lay burning, a mother heard it and looked at the useless brown bottle on her mantle and began, God help her, to think. 12 days out from the vestry, the sexton stopped keeping the graves apart by name and dug them in a row. The toll passed 40 souls out of 340 in 12 days. More than 1 in 10 of all the living in Nettlefield carried up the churchyard path and put down in the fen clay, and every one of them had drunk from a well that a woman had stood up and named. And still it climbed. Off the low green, up the lanes, toward the good houses, toward the vicarage on the green with its clipped yew and its brass door knocker. Toward Mrs. Honoria Pruitt. She was 44, the vicar's wife, and she had led the shunning of Judith Merrow with the tidy cruelty that only the respectable can manage. She had turned the pews. She had let it be known which door a Christian woman crossed, and which she did not. She had a boy, her only one, and she had walked him past the widow's weed patch 100 times with her chin up and her skirts gathered as though the very garden might soil him. And now her boy woke in the night and said his belly griped, and by morning he could not keep down water, and by evening the cramps had him doubled and screaming. And Mrs. Pruitt held him, and felt the heat go strange in him, felt the awful cold creep into his small hands even as he burned, and saw, she had seen it now on other children through other windows, saw the grey blue begin to come up under his skin. She sent for Finch. Of course, she sent for Finch. She was the vicar's wife, and he was the man of science, and the drops were finished, and there was no one else a woman of her standing could be seen to send for. Finch came. And Finch, for the first time in his young certain life, stood over a sick bed and had nothing. He had bled his patients, and they had died. He had purged them, and they had died. He had done everything his books held, and the books were empty, and the boy on the bed was sinking in front of him, and Ambrose Finch, 29, London-trained, stood in the vicarage bedroom with his shining, useless tools and his hands hanging at his sides. And he was afraid in the particular way of a man who has just understood that everything he was sure of is wrong. Mrs. Pruitt looked at his face, and she saw there was no help in it, and that, for a proud woman, was the end of pride. It was near midnight. The rushlight guttered. Down at the end of Sedge Row, Judith Merrow was at the bottom of her own strength. She had not slept a full night in 12 days. She had crossed the parish in the dark more times than she could count, spooned water into more children than she could name, and her stores were nearly gone, the blackberry root down to dust and sticks, the clean sheeting all torn and used, the salt and the sugar scraped from the bottoms of their crocks. She was grey. Her hands, that had never shaken over a wound in the Crimea nor here, had begun to shake. She sat by her cold hearth with the empty crocks around her, and she thought, in a plain and tired way, that she had done what she could, and it had not been enough, and that she was too old and too spent to do much more. And then she heard them on the lane. Feet, many feet, and voices, low and broken and coming closer, and a knocking that started at the top of the row and grew as it came, and then it was at her own gate, the gate the children had once torn her herbs across, and fists were on her door, the door they had once walked her to and shut in her face, and they were pounding on it now, all of them, the low green come up the lane in the dark, and a woman's voice above the rest, cracked open with terror, calling her name. Judith Merrow. Not the widow, not the weed woman. Her name. She rose from the cold hearth. She was 53 years old, and grey with exhaustion, and her hands shook, and she crossed her small kitchen, and she lifted the latch, and she opened the door. They filled her yard. A dozen of them. More. Faces she knew. Faces that had laughed at the vestry, and turned in the pew, and stood by while she was walked to a door. Lamplight and rushlight shaking over them. And at the front, of all people, at the front stood Mrs. Honoria Pruitt, the vicar's wife, who had led them all in the shunning of her, and Mrs. Pruitt's fine face was ruined with crying, and she had her hands out, and she said, "She got it out somehow, my boy. Mrs. Merrow, my boy is dying, and the doctor can do nothing, and they say your ones don't die. There it is. The whole of it in 6 words. They say your ones don't die." Now, a smaller woman would have had her moment here. A smaller woman would have stood in that lit doorway with the whole mocking parish begging on her step and taken one long sweet minute to remind them. You called it weeds. You called it widow's grief. You walked me to the door. Judith Merrow did not take the minute. She was already turning back into the kitchen before Mrs. Pruitt had finished, already reaching for the kettle. "The fire," she said, over her shoulder, in the flat, quick voice of a woman who has run toward the sound of the guns before. Someone build the fire up. You, to a big tannery man who had once laughed loudest, the pump, fill every crock on that shelf and set them boiling. And don't tell me it's clean, boil it. You, to another, there's dry root in the far crock, the last of it, bring it. And they moved. God, they moved. Grown men and hard women, who a fortnight ago would not meet her eye, were suddenly falling over themselves to do the bidding of the widow at the end of Sedge Row, because she was the only creature in Nettlefield who sounded as if she knew what to do. And then, because there was no time, and the boy at the vicarage was sinking, Judith Merrow did the thing she had not done in 3 winters. She dropped to her knees and reached under her own bed and drew out the box. The field kit. Her Thomas's. Brass-cornered, oiled, wrapped in its oilcloth. She had oiled the hinges every month, and never once opened it before them all. She threw back the lid now on her kitchen table because she needed what was in it, the little scales, the measures, the clean-kept instruments a sergeant of the medical train had carried through the Crimea, and as she snatched the tray up, papers slid loose from beneath it and spilled across the deal boards into the light. Doctor Ambrose Finch had followed the crowd down. He was standing in her doorway, and his eye fell on the spilled papers. A commendation, printed and signed. To Judith Merrow, for service rendered to the sick and wounded of Her Majesty's Army in the hospital at Scutari. And beneath it a letter, folded soft with handling, in a hand that Finch, a London medical man of 29, knew at once, knew the way you would know a king's seal. A famous hand, the most famous nursing hand in England, the Lady of the Lamp herself, thanking one of her own by name. Finch bent and read it. And the young doctor who had called her old wife Superstition to a room of 40 went white to the lips. He straightened, and he looked at the grey, tired woman throwing salt into boiling water on her own hearth, and he said her name, Mrs. Merrow, and it did not come out the way it had at the vestry. It came out the way you say a rank, a title, a thing you have just understood you should have been standing up for. You were at Scutari, he said. You nursed under, I nursed men dying of this same flux by the 100, she said, not looking up, working, intense, in the mud. We learned it there, Doctor, what the books hadn't caught up to yet. It's not the air. It never was the air. It's the water. You put back what the body pours out, clean water, salt, a little sugar, spoon by spoon, hour by hour, and you do not, whatever you have been taught, you do not bleed a man who is already dry, nor purge a body that is already pouring itself out onto the floor. You have been killing them, sir. Gently and by the book. But killing them. She said it without heat. That was the terrible weight of it. No triumph, just the plain fact laid down like a stone. And Finch, who had bled a dozen children into their graves that fortnight, stood in her doorway and took it full in the chest, and the certainty went out of him all at once, and what was left was a young man who wanted, more than he had ever wanted to be right, to now be useful. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I'll carry it myself." And he did. That is the thing you must not skip past. Ambrose Finch, London-trained, physician to the parish, took up a yoke of boiled crocks on his own educated shoulders and carried the widow's water into the sick houses of the Low Green through the rest of that night and every night after, and he spooned it as she had shown him. And he threw his lancet in his bag and did not draw it again. But that was still to come. First there was the boy. Judith went to the vicarage. Mrs. Pruitt at her side the whole mile, carrying a crock like a servant, not caring who saw, past caring about anything but the small burning weight she had left in that bed. And they climbed the stairs to the room where the vicar's only son lay grey and sunk-eyed and barely breathing, the flux having wrung him near dry. And Judith Merrow set down her box and rolled her sleeves and went to work the way she had worked at Scutari, with the guns going in the dark. She stripped the fouled bed. She washed him. She lifted his head in the crook of her arm, and she began the long, slow labour that no bottle and no lancet could ever do, a spoon of clean salted water to the lips, and wait, and another, and wait. Hour upon hour upon hour, through the whole of that night, patient as the tide, putting back, drop by drop, what the sickness poured out. Mrs. Pruitt knelt on the other side of the bed. The proud woman knelt on the bare boards all night and watched a pair of work-hardened hands do gently what all her standing and all Finch's science could not, and somewhere in the small hours she reached across her dying child and laid her own soft hand over Judith Merrow's rough one, and neither woman said a word, and nothing needed saying, because everything between them was being paid, right there, in silence, over the bed. And near dawn the boy's breath changed. It deepened. It steadied. The awful cold went out of his hands, and a living warmth came back, and the grey blue faded from under his skin to a plain, pale child's pallor, and he opened his eyes and asked, in a small cross voice, for a drink of water, and Judith Merrow gave him one, clean and boiled, off her own spoon, and he drank it and held it down. And the vicar's wife put her face in the bedclothes and wept as the light came up grey and then gold in the window. The boy would live. He was not the last she saved that week, but he was the one that broke it. For when it was known through the parish that the vicarage boy had been at death's door and the widow had brought him back, the last of the pride went out of Nettlefield, and every door that had a sick soul behind it opened to her, and to Finch carrying her water, and the dying slowed, and then it stopped, and the sexton put down his spade. And into that turning, 3 days later, came a man in a plain dark coat, with a leather board under his arm and a pencil behind his ear, down from the county town, sent by the Board of Health, asking for the well. His name was Wren, Inspector Wren. He had a map, and he had the burial register, and he had a cool official eye, and he walked the low green row in the morning light, with half the parish trailing behind him, and he stopped at the tannery end, 1 mile from the church, at a low green well mouth beside the old midden, and he looked at it a long moment, and he dipped a glass, and he held the water up to the light where they could all see it, faintly clouded, faintly wrong. "This is your source," he said. "Every death in your register traces up this lane to this well. It stands not 10 feet from an open midden, and the seep runs straight into it. Cholera does not ride the air, whatever you have been told. It rides the water. This well has been fouling your parish since the heat came." He looked at his board. He looked up. Was there no warning of this? Did no one raise it? And the silence in that lane, among the people who had laughed at the July vestry, was a thing you could have leaned your weight against. It was Mrs. Pruitt who spoke, the vicar's wife, who had led the shunning. She said, clear, so all of them could hear her name herself for what she had been, "There was a warning, sir, in the vestry." In July, a woman stood up and told us this well, this exact well, would bring the flux, and begged us to move the midden and boil the water. And we laughed at her, sir, and we called it weeds and widow's grief, and we walked her to the door. Her voice did not break. She made herself say the whole of it. Her name is Judith Merrow, and she was right in every particular, and she has saved more of this parish in a fortnight than the doctor and the apothecary together, and she never once asked us to be sorry. Wren looked at his register. He had it there in his hand, the plain arithmetic of it, and he read it out into the morning air, because a fact read aloud is heavier than a fact written down. The dead, better than 40, near all of them Finch's bled and Coldwell's dosed, near all of them off this well. And against them, house by house, the ones the widow had reached in the dark with her clean boiled water, living, every one. He read the 2 columns and let them stand side by side in the light, and there was no arguing with it, and no one tried, and in the same hour, as if the world meant to close every account on the one morning, word came up the county road of Silas Coldwell. He had not reached his safety. The trap had been stopped at the turnpike by an officer of that same Board of Health, and his strong-box opened, and his crated cordial drops seized and sent to be tested, and the test had come back while he sat waiting on the county's charge. His certain preventative and cure for cholera morbus was chalk and water, and a little cheap gin to give it a bite on the tongue. 2 shillings and 6pence, then 4 shillings for chalk and watered gin, sold by the crate to a parish burying its children. There is a name for that, and the county had it, and Silas Coldwell, churchwarden, apothecary, 8 and 40, was ruined in a single morning, and would never keep a shop nor stand in a vestry again. They brought this news to Judith Merrow, where she stood at the low green well among the people who had mocked her. All of it, the inspector's verdict, the columns read aloud, the apothecary run to ground and shamed, the doctor at her elbow with his lancet thrown away, the vicar's wife naming her before the whole parish. Here was the minute. If ever a soul in this world had earned the right to stand in the sun and let the reckoning wash over the people who had wronged her, it was this grey, tired widow, vindicated to the last particular, with every one of her mockers standing shamed in a ring around her. She did not take it. She looked at them all, Finch with his head down, Mrs. Pruitt with her eyes wet, the tannery men who had laughed loudest now waiting on her word, and what she said was small and plain, and it was the only thing she said, and it undid them more thoroughly than any accusation could have. "There's boiled water on the hearth," she said, "and a bed in the barn for any that's still fetching for the sick. I'll not turn a soul from either." And then she thanked, by name, the 2 men who had carried her barrels down from Sedge Row that morning thanked them plainly for the work, and turned her back on the whole reckoning to kneel by a child who was still poorly on a doorstep, and went back to the only thing she had ever wanted to do. That is the woman. That is the whole of her. She had no use for their shame. She only ever had use for their water being clean. Autumn came to Nettlefield. The heat broke, as it always breaks, and the fens went gold and grey, and the flux went out of the parish and did not come back. The low green well was capped. The inspector saw to it, a stone laid over its mouth and mortared down, and the old midden was carted a mile off past the tannery to where no seep could reach a water. The row that had rung with dying that summer went quiet and ordinary again, children in the doorways, washing on the lines, and a strange thing happened at the vestry, the same vestry that had walked her to a door in July. They met in the autumn, and they voted, without one voice against, to fund the widow's garden, to pay for the seed and the glass and the drying racks, so that the physic Judith Merrow grew should never again be a thing she made alone and gave away unthanked in the dark. Village girls came to her gate now in the mornings, sent by their mothers, the same mothers, to learn at her side which root stops a flux, and how you dress a burn, and why, above all things, you boil the water. She taught them plainly, the way she did everything, and asked nothing for it. There was a new board over the plot by winter. Someone had painted it and set it on the gate where the old torn herbs had been thrown. It did not say the widow's weed patch. It said, in plain letters, the physic garden. And she let it stand, though she had not asked for it, because it was true, and Judith Merrow had never in her life minded a true thing. As for the others, Silas Coldwell did not come back. The county had tested his chalk and found him out, and a chemist who has sold chalk to the dying is a chemist no town will have. He was last heard of gone north, clerking for another man, his shop on the Nettlefield High Street standing empty with the little brass bell still on the door, ringing for no one. The county, they said, has no use for a chemist who sold chalk. Dr. Ambrose Finch stayed. That was the surprise of it, and to his credit, he might have gone. Ashamed, he did not. He stayed and he learned, and he threw away the lancet for good, and he came often to the garden at the end of Sedge Row to sit with the old army nurse and ask her what she had seen in the tents at Scutari that his books had never told him. The doctor still calls on the parish. But now, they say in Nettlefield, now he knocks first. And Mrs. Honoria Pruitt, who had turned the pews and led the shunning, her boy grew up strong, and she did not forget a single hour of the night on those bare boards. She had the churchwardens keep the pew nearest the door empty, the humble pew, so that the widow should always have a place at the front of the church that had turned its back on her. And Judith Merrow came to church that autumn, and looked at the fine-kept pew waiting for her by the door, and walked past it, and took instead the plain seat she happened to like, in the middle, among everyone. She would not be made high any more than she had let herself be made low. She only ever wanted her own place, and to be let keep it. That is the end of it, near enough. There is a thing worth carrying home from the garden at the end of Sedge Row, and it is only this. Some gardens are called useless, some old hands are called soft, and some old warnings are called superstition, and the young and the certain and the well-shod walk a wise woman to the door and shut it, and go back to their bottles and their books. And the garden goes on, growing what it grows, quiet, in the sun, waiting, because a garden is only ever called useless by those who have not yet, themselves, been sick. They mocked the widow's useless herb garden. They mocked it until the fever sent them, one broken household at a time, up the dark lane to her door, and she opened it, every time, and put the kettle on. If this story reached you, do one small thing for me. Comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far the widow's story travels.